We have all these basins along the North Anatolian Fault. They're wonderful because, as you can see in these very boring looking stratigraphic sections, they give us timing. When do these basins get going? They tell us when the fault starts moving. So, next, not only do they tell us when this fault starts moving and how it progresses, it further tells us that it speeds up with time. Next, these are the cross-sections. Every one of these basins, you have to know the geology to be able to interpret it, what they are. Are they wedge basins? Are they pull-apart basins? Are they sac ponds? Every one of these have a different kinematic interpretation. All of these things you have to map and interpret. Next slide. The same thing we've done at the bottom of the Sea of Marmara. The 1999 earthquakes in Turkey killed about 40,000 people. They were immensely useful, not because they killed people, but because they enabled us to start campaigns in the sea, particularly under the leadership of Xavier Le Pichon. Xavier got so excited about the earthquake and the fact that the fault was going right underwater, and himself being a marine geophysicist, he was jumping up and down with excitement, and he started all these projects, wonderful projects with French and European Union money. And we now know the geology of Marmara better than any other inland sea. And we can map our basins. We can look at their geometry in a way that we can't do on land, it's too expensive. And with drills, we can look at the timing. Next. Now this shows you that the fault started, of course, with zero velocity. Otherwise you'd get infinite acceleration, which you can't have, right? And then, look, it gradually accelerates and comes to the present day velocity of the fault. Now, some people say, well, you know, the fault started, the fault has a rate of movement so and so, and it has an offset so and so, well, it must have moved exactly. You say, oh, how interesting. Because this bloody fault is of different ages and different places. And it has not had the same speed throughout its history. Therefore, please do your geology properly before you say anything about how and when this fault moved. And this shows you the result of years and years of actual mapping, fossil collections, dating. And finally you come up with this picture. And this picture contradicts many of the facile models that have been built on pure physics and mathematics. Next. Look at the courses of the rivers in Anatolia. That's another funny thing. You know, we learned that these rivers come, they set the fault, move on. This is what our textbooks teach us. But they don't do that, do they? I mean, look at the Ganges. This is the Kazuma. Look at where it bends. It's back. Also in Iris, which is the issue, classical Iris. Look at Euphrates. It looks as if these rivers sense the fault before they get there. Well, how is that possible? That's absurd. Well, it isn't if you map it properly. Next. That's Euphrates. You see, the way it comes into the North Anatolian Fault. And if you look at these are not pristine areas, they're all faulted. Next slide. This is Iris. Look how Iris makes meanders. But these meanders really don't make much sense in terms of a meandering river. And again, when you map it, you realize every meander corresponds with a fault. Next. So, when you have a river that enters a faulted area, it never encounters a single fault. And you can see, you can build your models in your mind as to how these bends may originate. And you say, well, if I have panels like that, parallel, with different offsets, with offset towards the principal displacement zone. I might be able to explain that next. And this is how perhaps these gentle bends form. And once you do that, you go to the field and you see, are these faults really there? And to your amazement, some are there, some are not. Well, how are you going to explain the ones that are not? Then you realize the pattern of faulting you've imagined is too simple. You have to move on and see how a shear zone develops. Next. Now, the shear zone developed within that weak areas in Turkey. These areas that are indicated in blue are all filled with deep sea muds, serpentinites, knockers of limestone. And these are suture zones that go straight down to the lithosphere. So these are weak zones. And to your amazement, they have localized these faults. And within them, strike-slip tectonics reigns. Next. Now, when you remember what my good friend Phil England and company have done, you see they have ignored all of that part of Turkey. They have taken everything from here on. Because from here on, it's all right to model. But when you come here, the GPS shows that within Arabia, there's a suture in front of it. You would expect that the velocity would drop. Now it doesn't. So Arabia has already incorporated all of that weak area in eastern Turkey, the whole squashy zone. And only when you cross its border to Caucasus, to the Caucasian mountains, does the velocity suddenly drop. And that tells you the deep structure of eastern Turkey. Next slide, please. You know that the same model, the thin sheet analogy, was published by England and Mackenzie in 1982. It was a wonderful model, and it did explain a lot of the GPS today. But look at Asia. Well, Asia is funny, isn't it? It has too many faults that don't appear on your models. And these faults are not bitty faults, they are huge. So something else is going on, perhaps. Next slide. Now, we jump back to 1924. What was going on in Asia? Well, Émile Argan, sitting in Neuchâtel, he gathered all the geological information he could, including expedition reports. He plotted them on an Asia map, and he tried to interpret kinematically how individual pieces of Asia may have moved, and he used Zeus's kinematic indicators. The virgations, the syntaxes, the ketung, the deflections. And he said, this is what we get. Now, you see all these structures that I've shown you earlier that appear on this map in different places. And Argan made certain assumptions. And these assumptions were, if you have a fold, okay, it probably shortened mostly like that. He said, let's make that assumption. And he came up with this picture. Next, he removed all the structures. He came up with a flow field of Asia. Now, if you have read Zeus's 1898 paper, the Asymmétrie des nördlichen Hemisphäre, and then his Sur la nature des charriages in 1904, you realize Zeus had been playing with this idea of the flow of continents. Argan and Taylor took this idea, they applied it to the entire continental surface, and they said, indeed, the rocks are flowing. And when Argan published this, nobody understood a word what he was talking about in the 1922 International Geological Congress, because geologists were not used to that. Next slide. On the left, this is the forward velocity field derived from earthquakes and GPS in Asia. This is Argan. say current data, data of present-day motion. Look at Argon. There is continuity right through the subquantum processes. Who is right? Ladies and gentlemen, Argon is right. This is extraordinary. This shows you that you just can't take present-day motions and assume that the planet has been deforming using the present-day vectors forever. They change. Why do they change? Because the entire continental lithosphere and the oceanic lithosphere, to a much lesser extent, is inhomogeneous. Because there is a history. Topography changes. Rock characteristics change. You can only know these things by mapping them. Next one. Okay, here is the seismicity of Europe. We have long heard about stable Europe. The only stable place in Europe is Russia. I mean, if you know what I mean. Look at the distribution of the earthquakes. Next slide. This is a map that my colleague, Dr. Nalan Lom, is sitting right here with another younger colleague. They have mapped and dated the faults in Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, when you look at that, you realize that all the earthquake hazard maps that are drawn in Europe are overly optimistic. Because they are drawn using earthquakes. But we know that the earthquakes can have a repeat time in Europe of 1,000 years. They don't show up on our hazard maps. This is what the still active plate boundary zone is in Europe. The plate boundary includes the Mediterranean, of course, but it goes all the way to the Tornquist-Tessera lineament. It enters North Africa, stops at the Atlas Fault. All of this area is dangerous from the viewpoint of earthquakes. In that zone, an earthquake can hit any time and really make your head ache. In Central Asia, same thing happens, but there the earthquake magnitudes go beyond 8, which is really frightening. Next. When you do your geology, you draw your plate boundaries differently. These are the real plate boundaries on Earth. I mean, Seth Stein, a very sensible geophysicist, Seth started thinking about that. And he thought that he invented the term plate boundary zone until I reminded him that Kevin and I had introduced that in 1980 already. He said, oh, I hadn't read that. I said, yeah, of course, because it was published in Journal of Geology. It was a paper on geology of Jamaica, which you wouldn't normally read. Okay. But this is the distribution of high strain on this planet. But in between, the plates also strain, as I just showed you. Next. This is what our geophysicist friends told us when plate tectonics came about. Right? And the geologists were trying to justify that. This was foolish. It was a wonderful thing to know that the Earth is divided into plates. Yeah, but they are the boundaries. And geology could have told us that. And this is Edward Jesus das Atmungsgebiete. This is a map I drew from his descriptions using his maps. And here I drew all the trend lines that he had drawn. I didn't infer any trend lines from Zeus's descriptions. I drew what he drew. Ladies and gentlemen, it is the most amazing thing. You can't move a line. This man's knowledge of world regional geology was staggering. I mean, Wilhelm Salomon said that he had an incredible command of the world literature. Not only did he have this command, he used to correspond with these people. I mean, he'd never been to East Africa. He discovered the East African Rift Valleys without ever being there. That shows you the power of geology. I mean, his analysis of the Altaids. I always say we could not have published that Nature paper that really told us how Central Asia was structured without Zeus's guidance. Next slide. This is the last slide. Here is the man. And these are his instruments. His geological map, his geological hammer, his compass, a letter which he used as a geological instrument. He used to correspond with people like mad, with other geologists using the same instruments. And he left us a legacy that still baffles me. And Argan said in 1922, when he addressed the International Geological Congress, he said, "Mesdames et messieurs, if the master were to return among us, he would touch perhaps a detail of a structure here or account for an episode of deformation differently there, but he said he wouldn't touch the main plan of the edifice because it stays true." And you'd be amazed that after so many years, almost 100 years, what Argan wrote remains true. So that's the merit of geology. It isn't to belittle anything else, but if you do your geology with these simple instruments, you'll go very far. Of course, then you'll go even farther if you talk to your geochemist, your physicist friends, etc. But if you don't do this, those friends of yours will get nowhere. That's the basic message I want to convey. Thank you. Thank you. This geophysicist won't let me off the hook.
Yeah, I think one of the key messages here is that we should actually talk more together.
Yes, absolutely. That we are one community, and what happened to geographers should not happen to us. That's really important.
So, Celal accepts to take questions. Are there any or comments?
Well, you can't be that gullible.
So now you're spoiling his mood because he said at the start that there must be someone annoyed.
Yes. Half of you, I hoped. Bilal, you don't count. You're one of us. Where? Oh, so poor Bilal has to move all the way there, in this old and infirm age of his.
Enjoyed your lecture. I remember you gave one to stratigraphers a few years back in Turkey, and at that time I realized that your knowledge of the history of geology is incomparable, and that we have so much to learn from you. So I think those are my comments, basically, that your lecture today really put together for us. How do I describe it? A historical perspective that is it is despairing.
Bilal, what you're trying to say is what Goethe had already said. Die Geschichte einer Wissenschaft ist die Wissenschaft selbst. The history of a science is the science itself.
Genau. Thank you.
Anke is right behind you.
Celal, thank you very much. I would like to relay a question that is not my own question, and I would have not posed it that way because I know my own answer, but I think everybody else, and I know that you will enjoy to answer the question. So I do think that our distinguished colleague Paul Hoffman is not here, but he was the one who has raised the question. He's challenging you in giving Edward Seuss all that much credit, because he says that Edward Seuss has not given due credit to the Precambrian, to the Proterozoic. So,
because Paul is ignorant, he hasn't read what Edward Seuss had written. The first chapter of Das Antlitz der Erde's third volume starts with the Precambrian, and Seuss says this is what may have happened, but he says we don't have enough data to go into any more detail. Now, Paul, being a Canadian, he was born on the Precambrian, and at a time where we can date it, map it, analyze its rocks, so he's being unbelievably unfair and somewhat ignorant.
So can you extend your answer also for your work on the Altaids? In what role does the Precambrian, the Proterozoic rocks play in your brilliant restoration of that?
Very good point. Let me start by pointing out why my very good friend Dan McKenzie has published 2 papers about the nature and formation of cratons. Being a good geophysicist, well, he started life as a physicist. He explained everything beautifully, but what he explained, what he described, doesn't look anything like the cratons. And the Altaids showed us that the reason why cratons like the Canadian Shield have vast, most of it, has a metamorphic grade at the surface between prehnite pompelliite and green schist at most. And the Altaids have the same thing. They have the same structure. They have the same sequence of events. And when I looked at places like Yilgarn or the Barberton Mountain or even Isua in Greenland, I went to the field in all those areas, and I was really flabbergasted about the similarity between the Altaids and these cratonic nuclei. And Altaids now is a cratonic nucleus forming